Hi guys, tonight we're going to explore one of the quieter but most fascinating aspects of the Second World War. How enemy nations managed to negotiate, organise and carry out prisoner exchanges in the middle of global conflict. While most people picture battles, tanks and air raids, in the background there were secret talks, careful agreements and unexpected acts of cooperation. These exchanges were rare, fragile and full of tension, but they showed that even during a world at war, humanity could sometimes break through. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. Now let's begin our calm journey. When World War II broke out, millions of soldiers and civilians were caught on the wrong side of front lines. Some were captured in the early days of invasion, others during campaigns that stretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Being taken prisoner was not only frightening but also uncertain, as each nation treated its captives differently. Still, both the Allies and the Axis soon discovered a practical need. Certain prisoners were too valuable to leave in enemy hands, while others could not be cared for properly because of illness or injury. The idea of exchanging these men and women started slowly, with cautious conversations, often through neutral countries. Switzerland, Sweden and the International Committee of the Red Cross became central players in these talks. They carried letters, delivered proposals, and quietly arranged the logistics, always reminding both sides of their duty under international law. At the heart of this system was the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, which set rules about treatment, medical care and communication. While not every nation respected these rules fully, they provided a common language to begin negotiations. A typical exchange might start when one side sent word through the Red Cross that they held badly wounded prisoners who would not survive unless sent home. In response, the other side might agree to release an equal number of their own prisoners in similar condition. Each detail required careful balancing. Numbers had to match, ranks had to align, and both governments had to approve. Ships or trains were sometimes prepared months in advance, with neutral observers watching every step. These exchanges carried enormous symbolism. For the families waiting back home, the return of even a single soldier was a miracle, proof that hope could survive war. For governments, they were political gestures showing strength and humanity at once. Yet behind the calm surface, the planning was complex. Routes had to avoid battle zones, timing had to be exact, and secrecy was essential to protect the prisoners on their way home. Some exchanges involved only a few dozen men, while others included hundreds, carefully counted and guarded until the final moment. Every success built a fragile trust, encouraging the possibility of the next agreement, and in those quiet moments, when the gates opened and prisoners walked free, the noise of war seemed to fade, replaced by relief, disbelief, and the simple joy of survival. After the first cautious steps, the practice of prisoner exchanges began to take clearer shape. Both sides understood that war placed enormous strain not only on armies, but also on medical systems, food supplies, and morale. Keeping thousands of wounded men in camps far from their homes created difficult responsibilities, and even governments hardened by years of fighting sometimes recognized the need for compassion. Exchanges therefore grew most often out of humanitarian necessity. A soldier who had lost an arm or a leg, or who carried wounds that made him unfit for further service, became a candidate for return. Neutral organizations helped to inspect these cases, confirming that the men being released were genuinely unable to fight again. Trust was always fragile, but without some level of honesty, the system could not work. The Red Cross played a vital role, visiting camps, checking records, and sometimes even escorting groups of prisoners as they were transferred to neutral ground. In many cases, neutral ships became the safest method. Painted with clear markings and flying the flags of their nations, these vessels carried wounded soldiers across dangerous waters. Their voyages were tense, submarines prowled, planes watched, and every crew member knew that one mistake could turn mercy into disaster. Yet most of the time, these voyages succeeded, and their success encouraged further cooperation. Another important category for exchange was medical staff. Doctors, nurses, and orderlies captured on battlefields were often allowed to return in order to continue their service. Each side recognized the value of medical workers, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also because war without healers could quickly spiral into unbearable suffering. These men and women sometimes crossed borders carrying the memories of what they had seen in enemy camps, becoming living witnesses to the condition of prisoners. For many families, news of such exchanges arrived quietly by telegram or local newspaper. A name listed among those returning meant sleepless nights would finally end in relief. Of course, not all prisoners were eligible. Officers with valuable intelligence, soldiers from elite units, or those suspected of escaping were often excluded. This created frustration and disappointment, as some men saw comrades return while they remained behind. Still, even these partial exchanges carried meaning. They showed that lines of communication could remain open, and that even bitter enemies could agree on limited acts of mercy. These small bridges across the gulf of war were fragile but real, and they gave hope that humanity had not been entirely lost in the fire of conflict. As the war deepened, prisoner exchanges became not only acts of mercy, but also matters of strategy. Each nation measured carefully what it could gain and what it might risk by returning men to the enemy. To manage this balance, special categories of exchanges were developed. One of the most common was known as grave cases, referring to prisoners who were seriously ill or wounded beyond hope of recovery at the front. These individuals, no longer fit to serve, were transported with the help of neutral observers. Trains or convoys would be arranged to carry them to border stations where one group would be handed over in exchange for another. The atmosphere in these moments was tense but strangely respectful. Guards who only days earlier had watched their captives with suspicion now stood by as those same men were guided toward freedom. Another major form of exchange involved civilians. As armies advanced, entire communities were displaced. Some citizens of occupied countries were interned simply because they held passports from enemy states. Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal often acted as intermediaries, hosting quiet meetings to arrange the release of such groups. Families separated for years sometimes found reunion through these exchanges, though the process was slow and full of uncertainty. In some cases, diplomats became deeply involved. Certain prisoners were considered too important to ignore. Senior officers, government officials, or individuals with international connections. Their return required negotiations at the highest level, often stretching across months of discussion. Here, every word mattered. A phrase in a telegram, a gesture during a neutral conference, even the tone of a note could shift the balance. Yet, even with this tension, the shared understanding of human limits allowed some progress. Ships became floating symbols of this fragile cooperation. Vessels designated for exchange often carried white paint with large red cross markings, visible from sea and sky. Their routes were carefully planned to avoid combat zones, and enemy navies were informed of their passage. Passengers on board described the strange silence of these journeys, engines humming softly, guards standing watch, but guns silent for once. At the destination, the exchange itself often unfolded in quiet dignity. Prisoners limped off stretchers or leaned on crutches, many with hollow eyes from months of captivity. Across the neutral zone, others waited to take their place. The moment of crossing was filled with emotion. Relief for some, bittersweet sorrow for others left behind. Neutral witnesses recorded every detail, counting heads, checking names, and ensuring no side broke its promise. These records survive today, showing not only the numbers but also the rare glimpses of cooperation in a war otherwise defined by destruction. Each successful exchange, though limited in scale, demonstrated that agreements were possible, and that even in a world torn apart by hatred, fragile acts of humanity could still be negotiated and honoured. By the middle years of the war, the practice of exchanges had taken on a more organised, almost ritualistic character. Both sides, while still bitter enemies, learned that predictability was the only way to keep such fragile agreements alive. Carefully scheduled meetings monitored by neutral powers became the standard. One of the most symbolic locations for these handovers was the small Swiss town of Kreuzlingen, where borders touched and trains carrying wounded prisoners could be met under the watchful eyes of Red Cross officials. The procedure unfolded with quiet precision. First, neutral staff would confirm the identities of the prisoners being transferred, cross-checking lists prepared weeks earlier. Any errors in spelling, rank, or medical condition could delay the entire process. Then, the prisoners themselves were escorted across narrow strips of neutral ground, often only a few hundred yards of space marked by flags and guarded by soldiers from both sides who stood at a careful distance. In these moments, silence was common. Each man carried not only his physical wounds, but also the invisible weight of captivity, months or years spent away from family, uncertain if freedom would ever return. When they finally stepped across the border, many simply lowered their heads, too overwhelmed to speak. For those watching, it was a scene of quiet dignity. Neutral observers scribbling in notebooks marked the numbers and times. They also ensured balance. If one side delivered slightly fewer men than promised, the other would not proceed until the missing individuals were accounted for. This insistence on fairness was crucial, because suspicion could unravel the entire fragile framework. Ships also remained vital tools for larger exchanges. Ports in neutral countries like Sweden or Turkey were occasionally chosen as meeting points. Vessels carrying exchange prisoners would dock side by side, and under the supervision of international staff, groups would disembark and cross gangways to freedom. For many, the sound of gulls and the scent of sea air became forever linked with the memory of release. Beyond soldiers and wounded men, another group frequently considered for exchange were chaplains and clergy. Religious figures, though often captured while serving with their units, were recognised as non-combatants and occasionally allowed to return to minister to their communities. Their presence during exchanges added a spiritual dimension, offering prayers or words of comfort that softened the cold mechanics of paperwork and counting. Newspapers back home rarely covered these events in detail, both for security reasons and to avoid raising expectations. Yet word always travelled. A letter from a returned prisoner, a report from the Red Cross, or even a whispered rumour in a small village could ignite hope. Families clung to these stories, believing that perhaps their own loved ones might soon be included in the next convoy. The reality, however, remained selective. Not all prisoners were eligible, and many were excluded by military calculation. Still, each successful event strengthened the sense that war, despite its cruelty, could be interrupted, if only for a day, by gestures of mutual recognition. These exchanges, repeated with careful rhythm, became tiny islands of order in the vast sea of chaos that surrounded them. One of the lesser-known aspects of prisoner exchanges was the role of correspondence. Before an exchange could even be proposed, lists of names had to travel back and forth through neutral intermediaries. These lists were long, carefully typed documents, sometimes running to hundreds of pages, with each prisoner identified by name, rank, unit, and often a brief note on his condition. The Red Cross carried these files across borders, delivering them to military officials who compared them with their own records. Every discrepancy had to be clarified. A missing initial, a difference in date of birth, or confusion over a regiment could delay negotiations for weeks. The process was slow but vital, because accuracy was the foundation of trust. Once both sides confirmed the lists, plans could move forward. The next step was the delicate task of arranging transport. Neutral trains were often chosen for land exchanges. Painted in plain colours and marked with clear insignia, these trains carried not only the prisoners, but also medical staff and international observers. Journeys could last hours or even days, depending on where the front line stood. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed. Some prisoners stared silently out the windows, unsure if the promise of freedom would hold. Others whispered to one another, rehearsing what they would say to their families after years of absence. In maritime exchanges, neutral ships carried the weight of responsibility. Crews were carefully briefed to maintain strict neutrality, and routes were pre-arranged with enemy navies. In some cases, lights burned through the night so submarines would not mistake them for targets. The passengers, meanwhile, lived in suspended time. They ate simple meals, received medical attention, and waited in the uneasy quiet of the sea. For many, this journey became the most surreal experience of the war, guarded by both sides, yet freed by neither until the final moment. At the exchange site itself, the ritual unfolded with almost ceremonial care. Prisoners walked down marked paths, watched by guards and neutral staff. At the midpoint there was often no handshake, no gesture of warmth, only a silent passing as one group moved out and another moved in. Yet within the hearts of those involved, the emotions were profound. Some wept quietly, others kept a soldier's stoic face, but all felt the immense release of uncertainty lifting at last. These exchanges did not erase the suffering of captivity, nor did they end the war, but for each individual freed, they marked a turning point, the first step back toward home, toward identity, and toward life beyond the prison walls. And for those observing from the outside, they offered proof that even amidst war's hardest edges, fragile strands of humanity could still be woven across the front lines. The role of neutral countries in prisoner exchanges cannot be overstated. Without them, few agreements would have been possible. Switzerland, long respected for its neutrality, became a hub for delicate negotiations. Diplomats from warring powers travelled quietly to its cities, often under secrecy, to present proposals and counteroffers. The Swiss government offered meeting rooms, translators, and above all the guarantee of impartiality. In Stockholm, Sweden also provided a safe platform, using its position outside the conflict to facilitate maritime exchanges in the Baltic and beyond. These neutral powers were trusted not because they were stronger, but because they had no direct stake in the fighting. Their officials worked tirelessly, balancing the demands of opposing sides while remaining careful not to show favouritism. The International Committee of the Red Cross, headquartered in Geneva, added another layer of structure. Its representatives moved between capitals, camps and battlefronts, carrying letters and proposals in sealed envelopes. These men and women lived with constant pressure. One misstep, one phrase misinterpreted, and delicate arrangements could collapse. Yet their persistence kept the fragile machinery moving. Beyond governments and organisations, local communities also played quiet roles. In towns where exchanges took place, civilians often witnessed the process. They might see long lines of prisoners marching to the border, guarded but silent, or glimpse trains filled with men whose eyes told stories words could not. For these bystanders, the events were a reminder that the war was not only about battles far away, but about individuals caught in its web. The neutrality of these places was never absolute. Rumours circulated, spies listened, and propaganda machines from both sides tried to twist the meaning of each exchange. A successful handover might be celebrated in one country as proof of strength, while in another it was downplayed to avoid appearing weak. Still, the practical benefits outweighed the politics. Hundreds of lives could be saved in a single agreement, and both sides recognised that public opinion valued even small gestures of humanity. At sea, neutral ships sailing under flags of nations like Portugal carried out their missions with remarkable courage. Crews knew they risked attack if mistaken for ordinary transports, yet they sailed nonetheless, guided by the belief that mercy was worth the danger. In the end, the neutral nations and organisations served as the thin but resilient bridge across a gulf of violence. They showed that even when armies clashed, the world still held a few places where dialogue, compromise and compassion could survive. Their work gave prisoner exchanges the structure they needed, ensuring that fragile promises were transformed into real acts of return and reunion. Among the most delicate exchanges were those involving medical staff. Doctors, nurses and orderlies captured while serving alongside soldiers occupied a special category in international law. Their role was considered essential not only for their own armies, but for humanity as a whole. If allowed to return, they could care for the sick and wounded, preserving life in the midst of destruction. Because of this, many agreements specifically included medical personnel. sometimes in numbers far exceeding the wounded prisoners themselves. The process of releasing medical staff was complex. Each side needed assurance that those being returned would not immediately rejoin combat units in another role. Neutral inspectors often checked their backgrounds and certified their professional status. Once cleared, these individuals were moved with particular care, often travelling with groups of wounded men they had tended during captivity. Their presence comforted the prisoners, offering a sense of continuity even during uncertain transitions. For the families waiting at home, the return of a doctor or nurse carried meaning beyond personal joy. It reassured entire communities that skilled hands would again be available in hospitals strained by endless casualties. In some cases, returning medical workers carried messages from prisoners left behind, quietly passing along news that could not be sent through official channels. Their words provided hope, reminding families that their loved ones were still alive. Exchanges of medical staff also highlighted the strange duality of war. On one hand, nations clashed with ruthless force, destroying cities and taking lives without hesitation. On the other, those same nations recognized that some lines could not be crossed without losing all sense of humanity. To allow healers to return was to admit, however briefly, that compassion still mattered. The ceremony surrounding these exchanges often reflected that respect. Guards stood back a little farther, orders were given in softer tones, and the atmosphere, though still heavy with formality, carried a sense of recognition for the unique role of those being released. Photographs from these moments, though rare, show lines of nurses in plain uniform stepping across borders with quiet dignity, their faces weary but calm. In a few instances, entire hospital units were exchanged, complete with equipment, so that medical service could resume quickly once the staff returned home. These events required enormous coordination and represented rare acts of large-scale cooperation. While such gestures did not change the larger tide of war, they served as powerful symbols. They reminded all involved that even amid global conflict, life itself remained sacred, and those who worked to preserve it deserved a measure of protection. In this way, the exchange of medical staff became one of the clearest examples of how mercy and duty could briefly align across enemy lines. Another important element of prisoner exchanges involved civilians caught behind enemy lines. At the outbreak of war, thousands of foreign nationals suddenly found themselves in hostile territory. Businessmen, students, tourists, and families who had simply been living abroad. When hostilities began, many were detained as enemy aliens. Although they were not soldiers, their presence created legal and political challenges. To hold them indefinitely risked international criticism, but to release them without conditions seemed dangerous. The solution, in many cases, was to arrange civilian exchanges, often through neutral states. These exchanges were complicated. Unlike soldiers, civilians did not always have clear records or ranks that could be compared. Negotiators had to match numbers as best they could, balancing nationalities, professions, and sometimes even family units. The Red Cross worked tirelessly to confirm identities and to ensure that families were kept together during transfers. Ports became the main stage for these exchanges. In Lisbon, for example, neutral ships sometimes carried civilians from both sides, meeting in carefully chosen harbours under the protection of neutrality. Passengers boarded with a mix of relief and anxiety, leaving behind months or years of internment to face uncertain futures. For many, the journey home meant travelling through seas shadowed by submarines, or across regions still echoing with battle. Yet the promise of reunion outweighed the risks. For governments, these exchanges served political purposes as well. Returning civilians often included diplomats and consular staff, whose presence could strengthen international relations once they were back in their own countries. At times, even journalists and teachers were exchanged, valued for their ability to influence public opinion. Each decision carried both humanitarian and strategic weight, and every agreement reflected a careful balance of compassion and caution. Civilians who experienced these exchanges often remembered the strange quiet of the process. Guards treated them less harshly than soldiers, but the procedures were no less formal. Lists were checked, names called, and every step observed by neutral officials. Families clutched their belongings tightly. Children peered nervously from windows, and adults kept their voices low. The moment of crossing into safety brought visible change. Shoulders straightened, expressions softened, and quiet sighs of relief spread through the group. These civilian exchanges highlighted the wider human cost of the war. They showed that conflict was not confined to trenches and battlefields, but reached deeply into ordinary lives. The return of even a few families became a sign of hope for entire communities, proof that diplomacy still had a role even in a world dominated by violence. Though far less publicised than military exchanges, these civilian transfers remain a vital part of the hidden history of how enemies found limited ways to act with restraint, protecting the lives of those who had never chosen to fight in the first place. While many exchanges focused on the wounded or civilians, there were also special cases involving officers and high-ranking prisoners. These individuals carried unique importance, both for their military knowledge and for their symbolic value. Capturing a senior officer could be celebrated as a victory, but holding him indefinitely was not always practical. He might require significant resources for security, and his continued absence could fuel resentment among the enemy. As a result, certain officers became subjects of delicate negotiations. These discussions were often kept secret, for fear that public opinion might accuse governments of weakness. The process began with quiet proposals delivered through neutral embassies or Red Cross representatives. Each side weighed the potential benefits of release against the risks. Would the officer return to active command? Could his freedom alter the balance of battles yet to come? Often, conditions were attached. Some agreements required officers to pledge that they would not return to the front, though such promises were difficult to enforce. Others specified that officers would be exchanged only for individuals of equivalent rank or status, making balance a matter of prestige as well as practicality. These exchanges were staged with the same careful ritual as others, but with heightened attention to security. Officers were transported under close guard, their names checked repeatedly, their movements observed by neutral staff. At border crossings, they stepped across with deliberate formality, often maintaining a stoic expression despite the deep emotions of the moment. Their return was greeted with ceremony at home, used by governments as a sign of resilience and power. Newspapers might carry brief announcements, carefully worded to highlight the nation's dignity, while concealing the fragile compromises that made such exchanges possible. Families of lower-ranking prisoners sometimes watched these developments with mixed feelings. The release of senior officers could raise questions about fairness. Why should generals be freed while ordinary soldiers remained behind barbed wire? Governments attempted to balance this by continuing to negotiate for the wounded and ill, but frustration never fully disappeared. Still, these officer exchanges served as reminders that war was not only fought with weapons, but also with symbols. To bring back a leader was to restore confidence, to show that dialogue was still possible even when the front lines remained locked in combat. The neutral officials who witnessed these events often described them as unusually tense, with both sides watching every detail closely, determined that no dishonour should fall. In the end, whether for strategy, prestige, or simple humanity, the return of officers marked one of the more complex chapters in the story of prisoner exchanges, moments when enemies measured each other not only in battle, but across the fragile bridge of negotiation. Exchanges of prisoners during the war were not always smooth. At times, plans fell apart at the last moment due to sudden changes at the front or shifts in political mood. One side might accuse the other of not honouring previous promises, or insist on altering the terms after everything had been arranged. These disputes revealed how fragile the system truly was. A single misunderstanding could cause months of work to unravel, leaving prisoners once again waiting behind barbed wire with hope slipping away. Weather could also play a role. A storm at sea might delay ships carrying wounded men, while snow or floods could block rail lines meant to transport prisoners to border stations. Neutral mediators worked constantly to manage these problems, sending urgent messages, rearranging timetables, and calming tempers. The Red Cross often found itself in the middle, reminding governments that delays were sometimes unavoidable and that patience was needed to protect lives. Another challenge came from the military itself. Commanders in the field were not always enthusiastic about sending men back to the enemy, even if those men were wounded. Some believed that every prisoner held reduced the strength of the opposing side regardless of condition. They feared that an exchange might free valuable intelligence sources or provide propaganda victories to the enemy. To overcome this resistance, civilian leaders had to emphasize the humanitarian principles at stake, as well as the diplomatic value of honoring agreements. There were also moments of tragedy. In rare cases, ships or trains carrying exchange prisoners came under accidental attack, mistaken for ordinary transports. Despite clear markings, the chaos of war sometimes blinded those involved to signals of neutrality. Survivors of such incidents later described the bitter irony of facing danger, even as they travelled toward freedom. These risks, however, did not stop future exchanges. If anything, they made the need for clearer communication more urgent. Over time, procedures grew stricter, with neutral countries insisting on advance notice of routes and schedules. This reduced accidents and built a greater sense of reliability. The human stories behind these difficulties were deeply moving. Letters preserved from the period show prisoners who had prepared to leave, writing farewells to camp friends, only to be told at the last moment that their exchange had been postponed indefinitely. The disappointment was crushing, yet when exchanges did succeed, the relief was magnified by these earlier setbacks. Each journey to freedom became a triumph not only over captivity, but also over the many obstacles that had threatened to keep it from happening. These ups and downs reflected the larger truth about prisoner exchanges. They were not guaranteed, but rather hard-won achievements that required constant negotiation, patience, and faith in fragile promises. One of the most fascinating aspects of prisoner exchanges was the atmosphere on the day of release. For prisoners, the moment often began with uncertainty. Rumours would spread through the camp that a transport list had been posted, and men would crowd around the notice board, searching desperately for their names. Those selected felt a mix of joy and fear. Joy at the thought of freedom, fear that something might go wrong. Packing was simple, since most had little more than a blanket, a tin cup, or a few personal items. Yet each object carried enormous meaning, a reminder of the months or years lived behind wire fences. On the journey to the exchange site, emotions deepened. Prisoners were sometimes carried in ambulances or walked slowly with crutches, depending on their condition. Guards, though still watchful, often behaved more gently, aware that these men were leaving for good. In rare cases, prisoners were even offered extra rations for the trip, a small gesture that hinted at respect for the process. Neutral observers travelling alongside them noted the silence that often filled the air. Men stared out of train windows or sat quietly on ship decks, holding on to the fragile hope that freedom truly awaited at the other end. Arrival at the exchange point brought a sudden shift in tension. Whether on a quiet railway platform in Switzerland or a neutral harbour in Portugal, the procedure unfolded with clockwork precision. Lines were formed, names were called, and every man was checked against lists held by officials. The actual crossing was brief but unforgettable. Some described it as stepping through an invisible wall. Behind them lay captivity, disease, hunger, and endless waiting. Ahead lay the unknown, but also the promise of reunion. At that instant, even the air seemed different. Many prisoners later recalled the first breath of freedom as a vivid memory that stayed with them for life. For those too weak to walk, stretchers were carried carefully across the dividing line, with doctors and nurses ensuring no one was left behind. Neutral staff wrote detailed reports on each case, preserving a record that remains part of history today. Families back home experienced the day differently. They often received little warning, sometimes learning of their loved one's return only after he had already crossed into safety. A telegram or sudden phone call could transform despair into joy in a single moment. Newspapers occasionally published small notices of exchanges, but censorship kept most details quiet. The real celebrations happened in living rooms and kitchens, where parents, wives and children embraced someone they had thought lost forever. For the prisoners who returned, the experience marked a dividing line in their lives. Even though many carried lasting injuries or trauma, the day of exchange stood as a turning point, proof that survival was possible and that even in a war defined by cruelty, moments of mercy could shine through. For many prisoners, the return home after an exchange was almost as overwhelming as the moment of release itself. Soldiers and civilians alike stepped back into societies that had changed dramatically during the years of their absence. Cities were bombed, families displaced, and the rhythm of ordinary life was disrupted by rationing, air raids, and constant uncertainty. Those who returned often felt both joy and unease. They were greeted with parades, small ceremonies, or simple family gatherings, yet beneath the surface lay deep questions. Could they fit back into normal life after so much time in captivity? Would their injuries or memories allow them to live as they once had? Governments tried to ease the transition by offering medical care and pensions, though resources were limited. Hospitals filled quickly with exchange prisoners, many suffering from malnutrition, infections, or untreated wounds. Doctors described the long process of recovery, months of rest, careful diets, and rehabilitation. Families faced their own challenges, adjusting to the presence of loved ones who had been gone for so long. Children barely recognized fathers or brothers. Parents struggled to understand the silence that often followed questions about captivity. Many returnees spoke little of what they had endured, keeping memories locked away. Yet the exchange still brought undeniable relief. Even with scars, both visible and hidden, the fact of being alive mattered more than anything. Communities treated returnees as symbols of endurance. In villages, church bells rang when groups of exchange prisoners arrived. In cities, neighbours gathered to welcome them at train stations. These moments carried emotional power, offering a rare sense of unity in nations otherwise divided by loss. The psychological effect of exchanges also rippled outward. For prisoners still in camps, news that some had returned home gave strength to endure. Letters smuggled back by exchanged men spread hope among those left behind, proving that freedom was not impossible. Families waiting anxiously found comfort in each success, believing their turn might come next. Of course, not every reunion was simple. Some prisoners returned to discover that their homes had been destroyed, or their families scattered. Others carried guilt for surviving while comrades remained. These shadows did not erase the joy of return, but added complexity to it. The war had carved deep marks on every life it touched, and exchanges, though acts of mercy, could not erase the larger tragedy. Still, they provided rare proof that compassion could survive even the harshest conflict. For every man or woman who walked through their front door after years away, the exchange was more than a diplomatic success. It was the restoration of a life, the recovery of a voice, and the reminder that even in times of destruction, humanity could still be reclaimed. Behind every exchange lay a network of paperwork and communication that seemed endless. Negotiations could not move forward without precise lists of names, dates of birth, ranks, and medical conditions. Clerks in neutral offices typed page after page, sometimes working through the night to ensure accuracy. Each mistake risked mistrust, and mistrust could cancel months of progress. Files were carried by hand across borders, sealed in envelopes stamped with official markings. In Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross kept vast archives where every card represented a single life. Families who wrote to the Red Cross asking about loved ones often received replies based on these same records, which were updated after each successful exchange. The paperwork extended far beyond lists. Agreements needed signatures from military authorities, civilian ministries, and neutral observers. Schedules had to be coordinated with train companies, port officials, and naval commanders to ensure safe passage. Maps were studied carefully to choose routes that avoided combat zones. The result was an operation that, though small compared to battles, required precision equal to that of any military campaign. Telegraph lines carried constant updates. A delay in one country had to be communicated instantly to another. Neutral diplomats sometimes found themselves awake at all hours, mediating disputes over numbers or conditions. Their language was formal and restrained, but the urgency behind it was clear. Lives depended on smooth coordination. For prisoners, all of this was invisible. They knew only the final moment when their names were called and their journey to freedom began. But behind that single moment stood hundreds of hours of invisible labour. Even the smallest decisions, what food would be served on the transport, what time the train would arrive at the station, were matters of discussion. Neutral countries bore much of this responsibility. Their staff were expected to be flawless, since both sides watched for any sign of bias. If an Allied prisoner received better treatment than an Axis prisoner, or vice versa, accusations could quickly arise. To prevent this, procedures were standardized down to the smallest detail. Each side received equal numbers, equal attention, and equal record keeping. Today, historians studying these exchanges often remark on the meticulous nature of the files that remain. They show the handwriting of clerks, the stamps of neutral states, and the signatures of officers who, even while commanding armies, paused to confirm the safe passage of the wounded. In the chaos of war, these documents provided order. They demonstrated that behind the roar of guns, there existed another kind of battle, a quiet struggle for accuracy, fairness, and humanity, fought not with weapons but with typewriters, ink, and the determination to uphold fragile promises. While the mechanics of exchanges required paperwork and neutral diplomacy, the emotional weight rested heavily on the prisoners themselves. For many, the news that they had been selected for exchange brought a flood of conflicting feelings. Some felt overwhelming relief, while others were almost paralyzed by disbelief. Years of captivity had dulled their ability to hope, and suddenly being told that freedom was near felt unreal. Letters from exchanged men often described those first days of waiting as the most anxious of their entire imprisonment. What if the deal collapsed? What if their names were removed at the last moment? The fear of disappointment lingered until the final step across the border. Among comrades, reactions varied. Those not chosen for exchange tried to be supportive, but sadness often showed in their faces. Saying farewell to friends who had shared the hardships of camp life was bittersweet. Some prisoners even asked those leaving to carry messages to families, or to tell the world what conditions inside the camps were truly like. In this way, every exchange carried the voices of many more than those actually released. The psychological strain of transition was profound. Captivity created routines. Wake at a certain hour, line up for roll call, eat the same thin rations, endure the same rules. To suddenly break that rhythm left men disoriented. The journey home felt unreal, and many described it as moving through a dream. Freedom was overwhelming not only because of its joy, but because it demanded a new adjustment after years of suppression. Families waiting at home also struggled with emotions. The return of a loved one was cause for celebration, but also fear. Would the man who came back be the same as the one who had left? Many were not. Captivity left marks invisible to the eye. Anxiety, silence, or sudden bursts of emotion. Some men found it hard to sleep in ordinary beds, preferring the floor because it felt more familiar. Others avoided crowded rooms, uncomfortable with freedom after years of barbed wire. Yet exchanges still represented hope in its purest form. They showed that survival was possible, that war did not erase every possibility of reunion. In communities where multiple men returned together, the event became almost a festival, with townsfolk gathering to cheer at train stations or ports. For a brief moment, unity overcame fear, and people felt that mercy had triumphed, even if only for a day. The emotional story of exchanges, though quieter than the reports of battles, was equally significant. It revealed the deep resilience of the human spirit. the ability to endure captivity, and the overwhelming power of the moment when a prisoner crossed from darkness back into the fragile light of freedom. One of the quiet but significant aspects of prisoner exchanges was the role of religion and faith. In camps across Europe and Asia, chaplains and clergy were often held alongside soldiers, yet their work was considered unique. International law recognised that spiritual guidance was as essential as medical care, and many agreements allowed religious figures to be included in exchanges. These men, and occasionally women, were often prioritised because they served not just individuals but entire groups. A chaplain returning home could bring comfort to hundreds of families, while a priest or minister left behind continued to nurture the faith of prisoners still in captivity. Their journeys reflected the same careful processes as other exchanges, but with an added sense of dignity. Neutral observers noted that even hardened guards sometimes treated clergy with a degree of respect. In some handovers, religious figures led brief prayers as they crossed the line, offering words of peace that contrasted sharply with the environment of war. These moments left deep impressions, reminding all present that belief and compassion could not be entirely silenced by barbed wire or orders. Faith also played a role in how prisoners themselves endured captivity. Men selected for exchange often spoke of drawing strength from small gatherings of worship in secret corners of camps, singing hymns softly at night, or listening to a chaplain read from a tattered Bible, gave them the courage to wait for the uncertain promise of release. When news of an exchange came, many saw it as an answer to prayer, a fragile proof that mercy could still break through. For families at home, the return of religious figures carried symbolism beyond the personal. Communities felt reassured that their spiritual life, fractured by war, could begin to heal. Priests returned to churches, rabbis to synagogues, ministers to chapels, each one bringing stories of survival and the quiet heroism of those still left behind. These accounts often reminded civilians that compassion existed even among enemies, softening the bitterness of propaganda. Of course, not all exchanges included clergy. In some cases, military authorities resisted releasing them, fearing they might inspire morale too strongly upon return. But neutral mediators pressed hard on this point, arguing that spiritual leaders were non-combatants and deserved the same protections as medical workers. Over time, more agreements reflected this principle, strengthening the humanitarian tradition. Looking back, the inclusion of religious figures in exchanges seems small compared to the scale of battles, yet its impact was immense. It offered dignity to the process, reminded the world that values of mercy could survive, and left behind records that show war was not only destruction, but also resilience of belief. These exchanges proved that even amid the harshest conflict, faith, whether religious, cultural, or simply belief in humanity, remained a force that neither captivity nor violence could erase. While most exchanges were organised quietly, governments also used them for propaganda. A returning group of prisoners could be presented to the public as proof of national strength or evidence of the enemy's weakness. Newsreels sometimes showed soldiers stepping off trains, greeted by officials and smiling families, with commentary that emphasised the humanity of one's own side while casting doubt on the motives of the enemy. These images, though carefully staged, still carried genuine emotion. For the men walking back into freedom, no camera could capture the depth of their relief. Propaganda often simplified the reality. Exchanges were not acts of generosity, but carefully negotiated trades, balanced by numbers and conditions. Yet the public rarely saw the complexity. Governments preferred to highlight the success, presenting exchanges as victories of diplomacy and morality. In doing so, they also encouraged faith in the system, which in turn helped keep negotiations alive. Behind the public displays, however, the reality was more fragile. Not every exchange went smoothly, and not every promise was kept. Some countries accused the other side of returning men who were less fit, or of withholding important prisoners. Neutral mediators worked constantly to calm such disputes, insisting that fairness be respected. Their detailed reports later revealed just how carefully each transaction had to be balanced. The propaganda value extended beyond returning soldiers. Civilians who came back through exchanges were also presented as symbols. Mothers reunited with children, elderly men stepping into freedom, and doctors returning to hospitals were all powerful images. Each story reminded citizens that even in war, their government could still protect its people. For those still in captivity, propaganda about exchanges created mixed feelings. On one hand, it offered hope. Seeing fellow countrymen return alive proved that negotiations were real. On the other, it deepened the pain of waiting, as they wondered when their own turn would come. Letters from exchange prisoners often carried encouragement, urging comrades not to lose faith. The enemy too used exchanges for image building. Allowing the return of wounded or sick prisoners gave them an opportunity to claim respectability, to show the world that they followed international law. In neutral countries, such stories softened criticism and helped maintain diplomatic ties. Yet the truth remained. Exchanges were rare compared to the vast numbers of prisoners held. For every man released, thousands remained behind wire, their stories untold. Still, the propaganda dimension served an unintended purpose. By giving public value to exchanges, governments made it harder to abandon them entirely. They became symbols that could not be ignored, gestures that both reassured families and reminded the world that even bitter enemies sometimes paused to recognize humanity. The sea played a particularly dramatic role in prisoner exchanges. Neutral ships, often painted white and marked with large red crosses, became floating lifelines for thousands of men. These vessels carried not only wounded soldiers, but also civilians, doctors and clergy, all travelling under fragile guarantees of safety. Every voyage felt like a gamble. Submarines prowled the oceans, planes scouted the skies, and one mistake could lead to disaster. Crews worked with discipline and caution, keeping lights burning at night to signal neutrality and following routes agreed upon in advance by enemy navies. The atmosphere on board was unlike that of any ordinary transport. Prisoners were quiet, some too weak to move, others staring at the horizon as though afraid it might vanish. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, tending to wounds and distributing what little food could be provided. Despite the hardships, there was also a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, many prisoners felt movement toward home. The symbolism of the sea mattered deeply. It represented crossing from captivity to freedom, from one world to another. Neutral captains kept careful logs, recording every name, every condition, every mile travelled. These logs later became evidence in international reports, proof that agreements had been respected. At the ports where exchanges took place, the scenes were unforgettable. Two ships, sometimes from opposing sides, would anchor close under the watch of neutral officials. Passengers disembarked slowly, one group moving down gangways while another prepared to board. There was no cheering, no loud display, only the hushed sounds of footsteps, stretchers, and whispered instructions. Yet the silence carried enormous weight. For each man stepping off a ship, it was the sound of life returning. Families often learned of these exchanges only after the fact, through telegrams or short newspaper notes. But in seaside towns, residents sometimes caught glimpses of the events from a distance, watching the silhouettes of ships meeting under flags of truce. To them, it was a reminder that even the vast ocean, dominated by war, could still be a place of mercy. Some voyages ended in tragedy. Storms forced delays, and in rare cases ships were attacked by mistake despite their markings. Survivors of such incidents carried memories of terror mixed with the hope of freedom. These dangers did not end the practice, but they highlighted its fragility. Each successful journey stood as proof that careful planning, neutral mediation, and the determination to protect life could overcome even the chaos of the seas. In the end, the image of a white-painted vessel carrying wounded men across dangerous waters remains one of the most powerful symbols of prisoner exchanges in World War II. On land, exchanges often unfolded at remote border stations chosen for their neutrality and security. These locations were carefully selected, far from major battles, close to transport routes, and suitable for medical convoys. A common scene involved two trains arriving on opposite sides of a small frontier post, each carrying prisoners guarded by soldiers and accompanied by neutral observers. The atmosphere was tense yet strangely ordered. Prisoners were lined up, their names checked against lists one final time. Neutral staff confirmed identities, making sure no one was missing or added without agreement. The process was slow but deliberate, for mistakes could unravel trust built over months of negotiation. Once verified, the exchange began. Groups of prisoners walked in silence across marked ground, sometimes only a short strip of land between two fences. For those who could not walk, stretchers were carried gently by attendants. The moment of crossing was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it resembled any routine movement of people, extraordinary because it represented the boundary between captivity and freedom. Guards from both sides stood watch, yet rarely interfered. Their role was to ensure order, not to provoke. Neutral flags flew prominently, signalling that this was not a battlefield, but a carefully protected space of transition. To the prisoners, the air itself seemed different as they stepped across. Behind them lay years of confinement. Ahead, the promise of return. Observers often noted the quiet dignity of these moments. Unlike public ceremonies, there was little cheering. Instead, there was relief, a release of tension that words rarely captured. For officials, the logistics did not end there. Medical examinations followed immediately, ensuring that the exchanged men were in the condition agreed upon. In some cases, doctors reported malnutrition or untreated wounds, sparking diplomatic complaints afterward. Yet the primary focus remained the safe transfer itself. Civilians living near these borders sometimes watched from a distance, aware that history was passing before their eyes. They saw men limping, leaning on crutches, or supported by comrades, moving slowly toward freedom. These images left lasting impressions, reminders that the war was not only about tanks and planes, but also about individuals quietly reclaiming their lives. The border exchanges showed how fragile cooperation could succeed when supported by discipline, fairness, and careful neutrality. Each successful handover strengthened the possibility of the next, proving that even amid destruction, a narrow path toward humanity could be kept open. Not all prisoner exchanges were limited to the wounded or civilians. Some involved groups chosen for political reasons. Governments sometimes used exchanges to ease diplomatic pressure or to improve relations with neutral nations. For example, when reports of poor treatment in camps began to circulate, an exchange of sick or elderly prisoners could be arranged to demonstrate compliance with international law. These events allowed states to claim moral credibility, even while the larger reality of captivity remained grim. The politics behind these decisions were complex. Military leaders worried about releasing too many men, while diplomats argued that small sacrifices could bring international goodwill. Families at home rarely understood these debates. To them, the return of even one soldier or nurse outweighed any political calculation. Yet for governments, each list of names represented strategy as well as compassion. The selection process could be painful. Officers reviewed medical records and intelligence reports, deciding who might be included. Sometimes men were excluded not because of their health, but because they were believed to hold knowledge valuable to the enemy. Others were chosen precisely because their suffering was so great that to keep them risked international scandal. Neutral mediators often pushed hardest in these political cases, reminding both sides that the spirit of humanitarian law demanded action. At times, prisoner exchanges also served as signals in larger negotiations. Agreeing to a small handover could prepare the ground for discussions on broader issues, such as the treatment of civilians in occupied territories or the exchange of mail and supplies. These indirect benefits gave added weight to each agreement. For the prisoners themselves, of course, politics mattered little. What they remembered was the moment their names appeared on a list. The long journey to the border or harbour, and the sudden flood of relief when the promise of freedom became real. Many later admitted they had not believed the rumours until the very instant they crossed into safety. Families welcomed them with tears, often unaware that the decision to include their loved one had been part of a quiet diplomatic game. In the larger picture, these politically motivated exchanges showed the strange duality of war. Even as nations fought brutally, they recognized the value of a limited cooperation. Each exchange, no matter how small, proved that dialogue could survive amid destruction. It was a reminder that even in the darkest years, governments sometimes chose to act not only out of calculation, but also out of recognition that humanity could not be ignored entirely. The experiences of exchange prisoners did not end when they crossed into freedom. In many ways, the hardest part began afterward. Returning to civilian life or to military service meant facing a world that had changed beyond recognition. Cities had been destroyed, families displaced, and the routines of peace were long gone. Some returnees felt immediate joy, but others struggled with feelings of isolation. Captivity left marks that could not be erased quickly. Malnutrition, untreated injuries and disease required months of recovery. Doctors described the physical condition of exchange prisoners as fragile: thin bodies, weakened muscles, and lingering infections. Hospitals in neutral or home countries became the first stop, where medical staff worked tirelessly to restore strength. Nutrition plans, clean beds, and steady care replaced the meagre rations and crowded barracks of captivity. Yet healing the body was often easier than healing the mind. Many prisoners found it difficult to talk about what they had endured. Silence became a shield, protecting them from painful memories but also creating distance between them and their families. Wives and parents often expected immediate happiness, only to discover that their loved one seemed withdrawn. Children were shy with fathers they barely remembered. Communities greeted returnees as heroes, yet the men themselves sometimes felt unworthy, burdened by survivors' guilt. Why had they been chosen for exchange while comrades remained behind? This question haunted many. Some tried to answer it by writing memoirs, describing camp life and the process of release. These accounts, while deeply personal, also served historical purposes, offering future generations a glimpse into the emotional reality of exchanges. Others chose silence, carrying memories privately for the rest of their lives. Governments faced challenges too. They needed to reintegrate these men and women into society, offering pensions, jobs, or the possibility of continued service. Propaganda often celebrated returnees, but practical support was uneven. Some veterans found work quickly, while others struggled, feeling out of place in a society focused on survival and rebuilding. Despite these difficulties, exchanges remained powerful symbols. They proved that even amid total war, individuals could come back from the brink. For every man who walked again through his front door, the exchange was a victory not just of diplomacy, but of humanity itself. These personal struggles and triumphs remind us that behind every statistic lay a human life, altered forever by captivity, yet given a second chance through the fragile system of prisoner exchanges. For the prisoners who remained behind after an exchange, the emotions were complicated. Watching comrades depart while they stayed created both hope and sorrow. In many camps, men gathered to say farewell, offering handshakes, whispered encouragement, or small gifts made from scraps of cloth or wood. They wanted those leaving to carry reminders of friendship back into the world beyond the fences. Yet when the gates closed again, silence often fell heavy. Those left behind struggled with envy and despair, even as they tried to celebrate the freedom of their friends. News of exchanges travelled quickly inside camps. Rumours spread about who might be next, when another list would appear, or which categories of prisoners might be chosen. Some men lived for these whispers, clinging to the belief that their turn was near. Others avoided hope, fearing disappointment more than continued captivity. Letters from exchange prisoners sometimes reached the camps, smuggled in through Red Cross channels. These letters, though censored, carried powerful reassurance. We are free. Do not lose heart. For those still waiting, such words meant more than food or clothing. They proved that escape from captivity was possible, even if only through negotiation rather than flight. Guards noticed these moods as well. After exchanges, discipline sometimes grew harder to maintain, as prisoners questioned why some were chosen while others were not. To counter this, camp authorities occasionally staged their own announcements, trying to control expectations. Neutral visits from the Red Cross became even more important in these times, providing prisoners with confirmation that negotiations continued, that the outside world had not forgotten them. The psychological impact of exchanges rippled far beyond the individuals directly involved. They influenced morale inside camps, gave families hope at home, and reminded both sides that prisoners were more than pawns of war. Still, the selective nature of exchanges created bitterness. A wounded soldier might wonder why his injuries were not severe enough to qualify. A civilian might ask why diplomats were prioritized over ordinary families. These questions had no easy answers, since the criteria were often political as much as humanitarian. Despite this, the very existence of exchanges prevented despair from becoming absolute. Each successful return was a signal that lines of communication remained open. Even for those still behind barbed wire, the sight of comrades leaving reminded them that freedom was not only a dream, it was a fragile but real possibility, shaped by negotiations they could not see but deeply felt in their daily lives. The involvement of the International Committee of the Red Cross was one of the strongest guarantees that exchanges would actually happen. Its representatives acted as messengers, inspectors, and witnesses, moving constantly between capitals, camps, and neutral cities. They carried sealed envelopes containing lists of names, sometimes travelling across dangerous routes to ensure that negotiations did not stall. Their neutrality was respected by both sides, though never completely trusted. Each government suspected that the other might use the Red Cross as a cover for hidden agendas, yet both knew the system could not function without it. Red Cross delegates visited camps regularly, recording conditions and interviewing prisoners. These visits gave them first-hand knowledge that supported exchange requests. If they found men gravely ill, they could report this directly to governments, pressing for inclusion in the next agreement. Their reports were precise, often noting not only medical needs, but also morale and treatment. Many of these documents survive today, offering historians a window into the daily lives of prisoners. The organisation also managed mail services. Letters from families were collected, censored, and delivered across borders, providing the only line of communication for countless captives. Exchange prisoners often carried bundles of such letters with them, ensuring they reached men still inside the camps. In this way, the Red Cross became not only a mediator, but also a lifeline of human contact. At exchange sites, their officials played crucial roles. They stood with clipboards, checking names against lists, counting each prisoner, and making sure that promises were kept. They recorded every transfer in detail, creating an official record that could later be used to resolve disputes. If one side accused the other of cheating, Red Cross notes served as impartial evidence. Their presence gave prisoners a sense of reassurance. To see the emblem of the Red Cross meant that someone was watching, that their fate was not left entirely to enemy guards. For families at home, the organisation was a symbol of hope. Even when news was scarce, they believed that neutral delegates still carried their loved ones' names in files moving across Europe. The Red Cross faced criticism too. Some argued it was too cautious, unwilling to challenge governments directly. But its strength lay precisely in its careful neutrality. By refusing to take sides, it remained the only bridge both sides were willing to cross. Without its steady work, the fragile structure of exchanges would have collapsed. In the larger story of World War II, the Red Cross demonstrated that even in the darkest years, impartial compassion could survive and create small spaces where humanity was defended. One often overlooked aspect of prisoner exchanges was the logistics of transportation. Moving hundreds of weakened men across hostile territories required precision almost equal to a military campaign. Trains were the most common solution on land. Neutral countries provided carriages marked with clear insignia, and guards from both sides stood watch as the convoys travelled slowly toward border stations. Inside, conditions were basic: wooden benches, straw mattresses, or stretchers for those too ill to sit. Windows were often shuttered for security, leaving the cars dim and quiet. Yet for prisoners, even the jolting rhythm of the train felt like movement toward freedom. At sea, preparations were even more demanding. Ships had to be stocked with food, water, and medical supplies, since many passengers were sick or wounded. Doctors and nurses were assigned to care for them during the voyage, while neutral crews worked long shifts to keep everything orderly. Navigation routes were planned weeks in advance, with detailed notifications sent to enemy navies to prevent accidental attacks. Despite these precautions, tension never disappeared. Every creak of the hull or distant sound of engines could stir fear that the fragile promise of safety might break. Aircraft also played supporting roles, though rarely as transport. Sometimes, neutral planes carried officials or documents, moving faster than trains or ships could manage. These flights required strict clearance from both sides, and pilots described the strange sensation of flying over battle zones with no weapons, carrying only papers and seals of neutrality. For the prisoners themselves, the transport was both exhausting and exhilarating. Many were too weak to climb steps or walk long distances, so stretchers and improvised crutches were common sights. Those who could still walk often helped their comrades, forming lines of support that carried men step by step to the vehicles waiting for them. Neutral observers wrote of the silence on these journeys, broken only by coughs, murmurs, or the faint hum of engines. The symbolism of movement mattered deeply. After years confined to barracks and yards, prisoners finally saw landscapes rolling past: hills, rivers, villages, or the open sea. Even if only glimpsed through small windows, these sights stirred powerful emotions, reminding them that the world beyond barbed wire still existed. Logistics teams worked tirelessly behind the scenes, planning meals, water supplies, and rest stops. Every detail mattered, for even small failures could risk lives or spark accusations of neglect. The success of these operations proved that careful organisation, combined with neutrality and discipline, could transform fragile agreements into reality. Though rarely remembered, the trains, ships, and planes of prisoner exchanges stand as silent witnesses to one of the most humane efforts carried out during the war. Among the most striking features of prisoner exchanges was the strict symmetry demanded by both sides. Numbers had to match exactly, and every detail was carefully balanced to prevent accusations of unfairness. If one side proposed to release 500 wounded men, the other side was expected to return an equal number, often of the same rank or medical condition. Negotiators debated endlessly over these terms, comparing lists line by line. The principle of equality was not only practical but also symbolic. Each government wanted to show its citizens and the world that it had not given more than it had received. Neutral mediators described these negotiations as painstaking. A missing name could halt progress for weeks. Even when all was agreed, last-minute disputes sometimes erupted if one side suspected the other of including prisoners less fit than promised. Medical inspections were therefore central to the process. Neutral doctors examined each prisoner before exchange, recording weight, wounds, and general health. Their reports carried authority, since neither side could accuse the neutral staff of bias without damaging the entire system. At the exchange sites, this symmetry was visible. Lines of prisoners marched or were carried across open ground in equal groups, counted by neutral officials with clipboards in hand. When one man stumbled, another was held back until balance was restored. Every action reinforced the idea that fairness was being preserved. For the prisoners themselves, this arithmetic often felt distant. They cared little about numbers. What mattered was the fact of going home. Yet they were part of a system shaped by balance, where each life was measured against another. Some men later admitted that it was strange to know their freedom depended not only on their wounds, but also on whether an equal number of enemy soldiers had been offered in return. Families rarely knew these details. For them, the exchange was a miracle, not a negotiation. They welcomed loved ones back with open arms, unaware of the complex calculations behind the reunion. Governments, however, understood the importance of maintaining the image of equality. To show weakness by releasing more than was received could damage morale. To demand too much could risk the collapse of talks entirely. The balance was delicate, yet it allowed the system to function. In this way, symmetry became the foundation of trust. It was a fragile trust, easily broken, but without it, exchanges would not have been possible at all. This careful weighing of our lives, though unsettling, was what allowed even the bitterest enemies to find a narrow space where humanity could be practiced, if only through the logic of equal trade. The geography of prisoner exchanges shaped their character in unique ways. In Europe, neutral borders like those of Switzerland and Sweden became natural meeting points. Mountain passes, quiet valleys, and remote railway stations suddenly turned into stages for solemn ceremonies of release. In Switzerland, observers often describe the dramatic contrast. Beyond the snow-covered peaks, armies clashed in brutal battles, while in these calm border towns, silence reigned as wounded men crossed a few meters of neutral soil into freedom. In Scandinavia, the long coastline provided harbours where ships carrying prisoners could dock under the watchful eyes of neutral staff. The landscape itself added to the symbolism. Icy waters, dark forests, and small fishing villages became the backdrop for events that balanced life and death. Outside Europe, geography played an equally vital role. In North Africa, exchanges sometimes took place across desert routes. Convoys moved slowly through the sand, escorted by both sides until they met at agreed points. The heat, dust, and emptiness made these crossings surreal. Soldiers who had fought in blistering campaigns now watched prisoners limping toward freedom under the burning sun. In Asia, neutral ports like Goa in Portuguese India occasionally served as exchange sites. Here, cultural diversity added layers of complexity, as men from Europe, Asia, and Africa all passed through the same harbours under the flags of neutrality. Local communities, unfamiliar with the politics of Europe's war, nonetheless witnessed these moments with quiet curiosity. Geography also shaped the risks. At sea, storms could delay or endanger ships. In mountains, avalanches or heavy snow-blocked roads. In deserts, heat exhaustion threatened the already weakened prisoners. Neutral mediators often wrote of the challenges in arranging safe transport through such difficult landscapes. Yet geography also gave exchanges a sense of timelessness. Men who crossed a quiet valley or boarded a ship in a remote port often remembered not only the moment of freedom but the scenery itself. The stillness of the mountains, the vastness of the sea, or the endless desert horizon. These places became etched into memory as symbols of transition, spaces where captivity ended and life began anew. Long after the war, veterans who had been exchanged spoke less about negotiations and more about the landscapes they passed through. For them, freedom was not only a legal status but also a physical journey across striking and sometimes unforgiving terrain. The geography of exchanges thus added another dimension to their meaning, reminding us that even in the most violent conflict, the natural world provided silent witnesses to fragile acts of mercy. Another dimension of prisoner exchanges was the impact on international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War had laid down principles for humane treatment, but its application varied widely during World War II. Still, the framework gave neutral countries and humanitarian organisations the language they needed to pressure governments into honouring exchanges. Legal clauses about the return of the gravely ill or the protection of non-combatants were cited repeatedly in negotiations. Even when governments were reluctant, the fact that they had signed international agreements provided leverage. Neutral diplomats often reminded leaders that failure to respect the rules could damage their credibility in the eyes of allies and neutrals alike. Exchanges therefore became more than acts of mercy. They were demonstrations of legal compliance. Each successful transfer allowed a government to claim that it followed the conventions, a valuable message in a world where propaganda mattered as much as battlefield victories. Of course, the reality was uneven. Some countries stretched the rules, releasing prisoners only when it suited them, or classifying certain men as unfit to prevent their return. Neutral inspectors challenged such practices when possible, recording detailed reports that revealed gaps between law and practice. Yet the very act of citing the Geneva Convention kept the spirit of humanitarian law alive during a brutal conflict. Lawyers and diplomats also saw exchanges as precedents for the future. They studied the methods, lists, and reports, hoping to improve the system after the war ended. Their efforts later influenced the 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, which expanded protections and clarified procedures for repatriation. Thus, the wartime exchanges had a legacy beyond immediate relief. They shaped international law for decades to come. For prisoners themselves, the legal framework was invisible but powerful. Most had no idea of the clauses being debated in distant offices. What they felt was the result. The moment their names were called, the journey to neutral ground, the crossing into freedom. But in truth, every step rested on legal arguments carried forward by diplomats and humanitarian workers. Families at home, too, were often unaware of the legal debates. To them, the return of a loved one was a miracle, not a matter of international law. Yet in hindsight, it is clear that the fragile survival of the Geneva system during World War II helped save thousands of lives. In this sense, prisoner exchanges stand as a rare example of how legal principles, even in times of massive violence, can carve out small but vital spaces where humanity is respected. Among the many stories of prisoner exchanges, some stood out for their symbolic power. One such case involved groups of wounded prisoners who had fought bitterly against each other only weeks earlier. When they met during an exchange, there was often no hostility, only quiet recognition. Both sides had suffered, and in that moment, the shared experience of survival outweighed propaganda. Neutral observers described scenes where exchanged men offered nods or brief words to those they were leaving behind, a gesture of respect across enemy lines. These moments revealed that beneath uniforms and orders, humanity endured. There were also accounts of unexpected kindness. On rare occasions, guards helped carry stretchers of prisoners from the opposing side, ensuring that the process moved smoothly. Though brief, such actions left lasting impressions. Prisoners later recalled that a single act of decency could remain stronger in memory than months of hardship. Symbolism also extended to the timing of exchanges. Some were arranged around holidays, giving them additional emotional weight. A return at Christmas or New Year was celebrated as a gift of life, even if the negotiations had been purely practical. Families gathered around tables with one empty chair suddenly filled again, and for a moment the war seemed distant. These stories spread quietly through communities, reinforcing faith in the possibility of mercy. In some nations, religious leaders spoke publicly about exchanges, presenting them as evidence that the principles of compassion had not been extinguished by violence. Even propaganda sometimes captured this symbolism, though usually in carefully edited form. Governments emphasized the dignity of their own men returning, while often minimizing the fact that equal numbers of enemy soldiers had also been released. Yet the truth was clear to those who experienced it firsthand. Exchanges were not about triumph, but about balance, about fragile steps toward humanity amid destruction. For the men who returned, the symbolism lay not only in the moment of freedom, but in the sense that their suffering had meaning. They became living proof that the system, however limited, worked. For those still captive, the symbolism offered hope. If some could return, perhaps they too would one day cross that invisible line. These symbolic moments, though often overlooked in grand histories, were essential. They gave emotional depth to the process, transforming it from a mere exchange of bodies into a reminder of values that war could not entirely erase. In this way, the stories of individual exchanges became quiet testaments to endurance, compassion, and the unbreakable desire for freedom. Not every exchange succeeded, and the failures carried their own lessons. At times, negotiations collapsed because one side demanded too much or refused to trust the other's lists. In other cases, military events disrupted careful planning. An offensive cut off rail lines, or a naval battle closed sea routes, making scheduled transfers impossible. These breakdowns left prisoners in despair. Men who had already packed their meagre belongings and said farewells were told to unpack again, their names crossed off lists as agreements fell apart. The disappointment was crushing. Neutral observers often described the atmosphere in camps after failed exchanges as heavy and silent, with hope drained away. Some prisoners stopped believing in future promises, convinced that they would never leave alive. Yet even failures had consequences beyond the camps. Governments faced criticism from their own citizens when exchanges fell through, especially if families had been expecting loved ones home. Diplomatic notes flew back and forth, each side accusing the other of bad faith. The Red Cross worked tirelessly to restart negotiations, reminding both sides that lives were at stake. In some cases, failed attempts led to improved systems. More detailed agreements were drawn up, stricter verification methods introduced, and clearer communication channels established to prevent misunderstandings. The very fragility of the process forced everyone to become more precise. For the prisoners, however, these technical improvements meant little in the moment. What they felt was the emptiness of hopes raised and dashed. Diaries and letters preserved from camps tell of men who sat awake through the night, imagining their journey home, only to face another dawn behind barbed wire. Still, not all hope was lost. Stories of successful exchanges elsewhere reminded them that even failures did not end the system entirely. The process was uneven, filled with setbacks, but it continued. For historians, the record of failed exchanges shows the immense difficulty of arranging even small acts of mercy in a world dominated by suspicion and violence. Every obstacle, political, military, or logistical, reveals how fragile humanity's bridges can be during war. Yet the fact that exchanges resumed after failures proves something important, that even when trust was broken, the will to restore it remained. The failures were bitter, but they also underscored the determination of neutral nations and humanitarian workers to keep trying, to push again for agreements that could bring men home. In this way, the story of prisoner exchanges is not only about success, but about persistence in the face of repeated disappointment. As the war drew toward its later years, prisoner exchanges became rarer and more complicated. The intensity of fighting, the growing mistrust between nations, and the sheer scale of destruction made agreements harder to reach. Yet even in this darker period, efforts did not cease completely. Some exchanges focused on the gravely wounded, whose survival depended on immediate return. Others involved civilians caught in occupied zones, especially women and children whose presence in camps created diplomatic pressure. The sense of urgency grew stronger. Each transfer was seen not only as a humanitarian act, but as a last chance to preserve fragments of international cooperation before the conflict consumed everything. For neutral nations, the work became heavier. Switzerland, Sweden, and Portugal carried greater responsibility, hosting tense negotiations while the sounds of war drew ever closer. Red Cross officials described their missions during these years as some of the most exhausting of their lives. Trains still crossed borders, and ships still sailed under flags of neutrality, but the risks increased with every month. Submarines, bombers, and shifting front lines meant that routes once considered safe could turn deadly overnight. Families waiting at home sensed the fragility of these arrangements. Letters from returned prisoners carried not only relief but warnings. Conditions in the camps were worsening, and those left behind suffered more than ever. These messages fueled demands for further exchanges, but governments grew cautious, fearing that too much generosity would weaken their bargaining power. Still, even amid this decline, the exchanges that did occur were deeply significant. They proved that communication had not been completely severed, that even at the height of destruction, a small channel remained open. Each successful crossing in these final years carried enormous emotional weight. Prisoners who stepped off ships or trains knew that their release was part of something rare, almost miraculous, in a time when mercy seemed to vanish. For many, the memory of their exchange became one of the defining experiences of the war, a reminder that survival sometimes depended not only on strength, but also on fragile threads of diplomacy. When historians look back, they see these late-war exchanges as proof that even in the darkest hours, nations still recognized the limits of cruelty. The number of lives saved may have been small compared to the vast scale of suffering, but each one mattered. Every man, woman, or child who returned home stood as evidence that humanity had not been completely lost to war. When the war finally ended, the story of prisoner exchanges did not disappear. It became part of the larger reckoning with what humanity had endured. Survivors who returned through exchanges carried their memories for the rest of their lives. For some, those journeys across borders or seas were the most vivid moments of the war, brighter even than the day of final liberation. They remembered the silence on the train, the salt air of a neutral harbour, the careful hands of nurses, and the first step into freedom. These memories became personal testaments to the idea that even in global conflict, a thread of mercy had survived. After 1945, governments and humanitarian organisations reviewed the records of exchanges in detail. Thousands of documents, lists, reports, medical notes and telegrams were preserved, forming a unique archive. These files showed the fragile machinery of cooperation that had saved lives when almost everything else was breaking apart. Historians later studied them not just for facts but for lessons. They revealed how neutrality, fairness and persistence could carve small spaces for humanity, even in a world at war. The legacy of these exchanges helped shape the new Geneva Conventions of 1949, which expanded and clarified the rules of repatriation, medical care and humane treatment. In that sense, the sacrifices and successes of World War II exchanges influenced the future of international law, giving later generations stronger protections. For the families who had lived through them, however, the meaning was simpler. Exchanges had been lifelines. They brought loved ones home, restored voices long thought silenced, and proved that survival was possible. In villages and cities across the world, the return of even a handful of men or women had lifted entire communities. These stories became part of family histories, told at dinner tables or passed down quietly from parent to child. They were not tales of victory in battle, but of endurance, compassion, and the fragile triumph of humanity over despair. Looking back today, prisoner exchanges in World War II remind us of a profound truth. War is not only fought with weapons, but also with choices. Nations chose to trade, to honour agreements, to release rather than to hold forever. Those choices saved thousands of lives, even if the numbers seemed small against the vast tide of destruction. In the calm of hindsight, these exchanges appear as islands of dignity in a sea of violence. They stand as proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, the will to protect life, however limited, never entirely vanished. And in that, there is hope, not only for the past but for the future.